Welcome back to On the Fly to recapping semifinal action from the World Junior Championship happening in Ottawa, Ontario. So we'll hop right on into it today, starting with the scores from today's games. And we start here with a 4-3 victory for Finland over Sweden. And this was a game that really was a back and forth game this entire time. And when we look at it, right, Sweden was the favorite team coming into this matchup, at least on paper. But the one thing you always have to remember is that in a Sweden-Finland rivalry game, both teams are going to come to play. And, Finland played a heck of a game today. In my eyes, almost a near perfect game, minus a couple blemishes with the goaltending. But other than that, Sweden kind of looked a little flat against Finland. And it sort of goes to show just how good Finland can be, especially with frustrating teams that they need to beat. And this semifinal matchup was no different. You think back to earlier in the tournament when Finland beat the USA, and very similar to the Sweden game where they kind of just hung around in it and got out to a lead and tried to hold it as best they could. But then the onslaught came, forcing overtime, and we all know how both those games ended with a Finland victory. So for the Finns, it just shows the resilience of this team and how good they've been. For Sweden, it's a tough loss, right? And I know a lot of people were expecting it, especially with some of the history. I know for me, I always had it as a toss-up. I wasn't quite sure. I picked Sweden just because it seemed like the obvious choice when it comes to the on-paper side. But of course, we've seen through this tournament that Finland plays a real good game, especially against a team like Sweden, where they know they have to play their A game if they want any shot at competing. Today, they did exactly that, picking up the 4-3 victory. The one thing I will say, and I've seen a lot about it, is the penalties. And I mean, right? I get it. I really get it. But at the same time, if you're going to lose a game, the refs aren't going to have that much to do with it, right? It sucks the way that it ended, but at the same time, Sweden had a power play just before that in overtime. That Finland penalty call was the makeup, and of course, Finland ended up scoring on the power play. So in the long run, tough game for the Swedes, right? They played well enough to win in my eyes, but at the same time, Finland played an excellent game today. And if they play like that against the US, I think they'll win it again. It's just a matter of which Finland team shows up and which US team shows up. And we'll get to the US in just a little bit. But, Sweden going to the bronze medal game, they'll play the Czechs. Finland will play the US, and it's going to be a good one. It's going to be another good one, right? Where we've already seen these two teams play. Sweden took it in the preliminary. Finland took it over the US in the preliminary. So, two teams, there's history between them already at this tournament, so anything can happen. And I mean, for Sweden in this one, the goaltending was decent. Finland's goaltending was shaky, and the one thing I will say is Petteri Rimponen, a lot of rebounds that probably Sweden should have got to. And in our tweets that we were doing for the game, that was one of the things I mentioned after the first period is if you're looking for Sweden, Rimponen didn't stop a single puck that he caught, and every puck went down and was a rebound. So it's the minor details that you have to be able to see and react on the fly to if you want any shot at beating these teams. Because for Finland, they're just going to play that trap style the entire game, clear the middle of the ice. So you got to get someone in there and force the rebound. So for the US, who does a pretty good job at getting the rebounds, one thing I will say is keep an eye out for them. If they're able to penetrate the middle of the ice, this game's going to get run away real quick. So 4-3 is your final here for Finland over Sweden in overtime. And now we'll move to the second game of the day between the US and Czechia. And this game, for me, was the first, I don't want to say the first because there's been some good games for the US. But for me, it was the first real game where we saw what the US was capable of. And, the Switzerland game, it was a good game for the US. I think they're up 7-1 after the second. The game against Canada, they looked decent. I wouldn't say they looked great, but they looked decent enough to win that one as well. And then today, they just looked like another better team. And I think it was probably one of the best games we've seen from the US. And, the quick passes, the breakouts, everything was crisp. And we talked about it yesterday with the Czech team, right? And what they like to do is they like to play a trap style, right? Where you make a mistake, it ends up in the back of your net. Today, it kind of felt like the opposite, where we saw the U.S. in many ways trapping the Czechs and capitalizing on just about every mistake. I think every mistake in tonight's game led to a goal for the Czechs. Well, not everyone, but at least a good opportunity. So for the U.S., if they can continue doing that, throwing other teams' games in their face, that's what makes them such a tough team to play against, because they don't really have a set structure they like to play with, but rather they like to play free. They like to play with skill, and we've seen it especially tonight where, the U.S. just looked like the better team for the full 60. And nothing against the Czechs. The Czechs played a pretty good game too, but unfortunately they just got beat by a better team tonight. And that was one of the things that we were kind of expecting, right? Where the Czechs, they've played a good tournament. They've contended with some of the best teams. They beat Canada. They had a real good game against the Swedes, but they just lacked that little bit of skill to help them put them over the brink. So, for the Czechs, they're going to the bronze again, looking to win it once again. And for the U.S., going for gold. And we'll talk about it in a little bit, but this U.S. team has found its groove, and they are scary. And they are like scary. So, for these two teams, expectations are high, right? For the Czechs, they're expecting a medal. For the U.S., they're expecting gold. And I think, anything short of that is a disappointment for them. So we'll see here sort of what goes on, especially in this gold medal game coming up tomorrow. But at the same time, real good game today from the U.S. The Czechs played well too, just got beat by a better opponent. And then we'll move on here now to the news. So we start here with Sweden as the favorites. And, coming into this tournament, Sweden was one of those big three teams that we talked about, right? Where it was Canada, the U.S., and Sweden. And we sort of came to that conclusion from what we saw in the pre-tournament, we saw with the rosters. And all of a sudden, this tournament kind of got switched around. As soon as once Latvia beat Canada, then we saw that, okay, it's not really a big three at this tournament anymore. You're kind of looking at the big five, and you're looking at teams like the Czechs, you're looking at teams like Finland to really dominate performances, because when you saw them in the pre-tournament, Finland looked okay. The Czechs, they played a decent game against Canada, but at the same time, Canada looked really good. Sweden looked really good. The U.S. was blowing teams out. So coming into this tournament, we were expecting a good performance from Sweden, and I have to say I am a little shocked to see them going out in the semifinals. Yes, Finland is a real good team, but with the team that Sweden had this year and their general team comp, you think about the opportunities they had to score today. Didn't really get to the middle of the ice like they need to. Didn't really get the rebounds that they probably would have scored on. The power play in that overtime period, wasn't great. And so for Sweden rather, it's a tough tournament, right? Because a lot of pressures, and I've been reading a lot about the Swedish media, right? And as a Canadian, I think we all can attest that, when you play in tough markets, it's hard to perform when you're going to get grilled afterwards. So for Sweden, it's a tough loss, because it's not just a loss. It's you're going to get grilled over the next couple of days about why you didn't win gold. And now they got to go out and try and play for a bronze medal again. So we'll see sort of what goes on here with Sweden. And I think you're going to see a real energized Sweden team that's already beat the Czechs once in this tournament, right? So I'm watching this one closely. It's probably going to be one of the better games we'll see. But for Sweden, tough tournament. And I can attest with Canada, right, where they looked good in the start, and they kind of each game that went on looked worse and worse. Sweden, in my eyes, actually sort of got better and better as the tournament went onwards. But at the same time, Sweden is a team that expects a lot from their junior team, and this year not living up to expectations. A tough loss against the Finns. They'll play for the bronze medal. Then on to Finland with the rivalry, and it's one of those things, right, where I know as a Canadian I can attest to it. I know the Swedish-Finland one is another one, right, where you come to play extra against certain teams where, it's that pride, it's that rivalry, right, where for Canada it's always been sort of the U.S. and it's been Russia, right, and you always see the team play just that much better against these big teams. And for Sweden and for Finland especially, they brought their game for the full 60 minutes today, and they earned that win. And they played real well too, I might add. The goaltending was a little shaky at times, but they played a near perfect game. So in my eyes, Finland is not a throwaway in this tournament, and I don't expect them to be a rollover against the U.S. I think we're going to probably see a real close game, and it wouldn't surprise me to see it go back to overtime, right? And these are two teams that are very evenly matched when you play their styles, right? Where the U.S. makes a lot of mistakes. Today they played real well, so I can't keep saying that. But, the U.S. in their history, especially when they played Finland in the last one, they made a lot of mistakes. And for Finland, who's going to capitalize on those mistakes, might be a tough game for them, right? So anyway, so for Finland, the rivalry continues, and expect a real good game, because the rivalry with the U.S. for Finland is also very historic. So don't be surprised to see a tough Finland team out on the ice against the U.S. And now let's talk about our friends the U.S. and they look dangerous. And I mean, when we look at this team comp coming in, this was, in my eyes, the best team we saw on paper, right? And they were the best team, in my eyes, throughout this entire tournament, maybe the exception of Sweden. But they played their game the entire time. They ran scores up like the U.S. does. They played good hockey. They made mistakes, as they always do, but they made up for those mistakes by putting pucks in the back of the net, as they're so good at. So for the U.S., this team is dangerous, and they're ready to play a team like Finland again, where, the first one didn't quite go their way, but this one, with what we've seen from the U.S., I think we're going to see a very different U.S. team take the ice tomorrow. And my favorites walking into this one is the U.S. yet again, as much as it hurts me to say that, but the U.S. is the team to beat at this tournament from now on. So tough team. Finland's going to be there too. It's going to be a good one. We'll see which team brings their game. To the news as well, we have the Czechs with the Rabo factor. The Czech goaltending has been one of the biggest things for them at this tournament. And it's the fact that they play a certain style of hockey where you're going to need to get bailed out from your goaltender every once in a while. And we saw that a lot today, where, Michael Rabo was the key to success for the Czechs in many ways, where he stopped a lot of point-blank shots. And against a tough U.S. team who scores a lot of goals, you need him to be real good. And he was amazing in this game. Just unfortunately, the Czechs couldn't find the back of the net themselves, and the U.S. sort of rolled over them. And so when we look at the Czechs, they're going up against a tough Swedish team again. And if they want any shot at winning, Harabel has to be, in my eyes, he'll be the starter, but he has to be one of the best players on the ice for the Czechs. And I think when we look at this Czech team, the way they're built, you need to rely on your goaltender. And I think, you're going to score goals off the rush. You're going to score goals from teams trying to force it through the middle. But at the same time, when you're playing Sweden, who has a real good perimeter game, and we've seen that throughout this tournament, you got to be careful, right? And Rabel's going to be a great piece to the Czech puzzle in beating Sweden. So that's what I'm keeping an eye on for tomorrow. A couple guys for the U.S. to see if they play their game, if they don't get bogged down in the Finnish trap style. Sweden, I'm curious to see which Swedish team shows up, because it's a lot tougher to show up for a bronze medal game than to show up for the gold medal game, right? It's not the prestige, and we've seen it in years past where, whether that's the U.S. against Sweden a couple of years ago, where I think the final score was like, I don't even remember. I remember it was a high score, like 8-7 or 8-6 or whatever. And it's just, sometimes it's tough for teams that expect gold. I mean, the Czechs are a team that are going to play for the medal, right? And that was their goal coming in, is get a medal and get out. And for the Swedes, their goal was to win the gold. And we'll see which Swedish team shows up, because it's going to be an interesting one there. So we flip over now to the playoff picture. So remember, back to the quarterfinals, U.S. won, Czechs won, Sweden won, and Finland won. And now to the gold medal game on January the 5th, where we have the U.S. and Finland. And then in the bronze medal game, we have the Czechs and Sweden. So, when we look at this, two teams ready to go. The Finns took the first round. The Swedes took the first round too between these two teams. So we'll see which team shows up for this game, and we'll see which team, especially for Finland, shows up to play against the U.S., because it's going to be a tight checking game all the way through. But now let's talk about it, right? So January 5th, that's tomorrow, our final day of coverage for this tournament. It has flown by, and I mean, it's crazy to think that this tournament started, Boxing Day, and we're already at January 5th. We're already through a new year. And so this game, right, these two games, the big ones. The bronze medal for the Czechs and the Swedes, 3:30 p.m., 7:30 for Finland and the USA. We will be doing live coverage for both of those over on Twitter at OnTheFly1515, so be sure to check us out there. But these two teams are going to go down to the wire, right? And the Czechs and the Swedes had a real good game, their first matchup, right? Where Sweden sort of scored two quick ones towards the end of the second, and that kind of turned the tide of the game where the Czechs started playing on their heels and Sweden kind of took control from there. But this Finland-US game, very similarly, right? Where we might see the Finland get out to an early lead, very like they did against Sweden, where if you have to try and claw back against a tough Finnish defense, it's very difficult. And the other thing I might add is for Finland, they had a goal called off, right? If they're for the offside. So they're a team that can score goals, number one, and they're a good team that's going to play you tough defensively, which the U.S. has struggled with at times in this tournament, you know, getting bogged down in the system, where we saw it even against Latvia, where it was a 5-1 victory. Probably could have been more, but Latvia plays a very defensive style, very similar to Finland, where they're not necessarily going to dominate the play. Sometimes they do, and in that last game against the U.S., they kind of did. But they're not going to dominate play. They're going to play tough for the full 60. But for Finland, key to success, hang around as long as you can against this U.S. team, because they're eventually going to make a mistake. And from there, you better capitalize, because if you don't, you're going home with the silver. But I do think this one's a toss-up, truly. I'm still going to take the U.S. I'm going to take Sweden again. I have trouble taking the Czechs, especially after the game they played today against the U.S. Sweden's a real good team in this tournament, and the Czechs don't really play with the same structure that a team like Finland plays. So I think the Swedes are, just by the way that they've looked, going to take this one. But at the same time, really could be anyone's game. You know, this tournament has taught me that you really don't know until the final whistle goes, right? Because that's the joy of hockey, is it's anyone's game till the final whistle. Whether that be, you know, the Kazakhstan-Slovakia game, whether that be Canada and Latvia, whether that be Finland and the U.S., right? Where you weren't really expecting these teams to win the games, but they do. So you can't count teams out at this tournament, but if we're talking about predictions, I'm taking Sweden and I'm taking the U.S., and I think I'm safe with those two. Might be wrong, you never know. Okay, to live questions we go. We have one question today from Kenny Kaminsky, who says, Sweden messed up by not starting Gidloff more this tournament. Also, I think U.S. played their best game so far tonight against Czechia. I hear what you're saying, but I do think Melker Thielen was good enough, especially for this game. You know, you look at the goals that Finland scored, and they're point-blank shots. So whether you have one goalie or the other goalie, it's tough to save those. And so as much as I'd like to say, you know, they probably would have won the game if they had the other goalie in net, I don't really think so. I think it would have been, I think even in the long run, I think Sweden probably would have lost by a lot more if they had the other goalie in it. You know, Thielen played a heck of a game against the Finns, and in many ways he kept the minutes. So he let in we let him 4 goals, and all 4 of those goals really weren't, in my eyes, the problem. And I think it stems from the defense. I don't think that Thielen would have stopped those. So, or Gildloff either, for that matter. So, you know, as much as I agree that, you know, if we're talking about load management, maybe, but in the grand scheme of it, you know, they started their better goaltending, right, in this game, and I think we saw that from start to finish here. And then the second part was about the U.S. playing their best game, and you know, I have to agree, and they just looked like the U.S. that we saw in the pre-tournament games, where they're scoring a lot of goals, they're looking good, and they're a dangerous team. So in the grand, when we look at it from that sort of outside perspective, the U.S. is the team to beat at this tournament, right? We lost to Canada, who in my eyes was one of the teams to beat. Sweden's now gone, and I think the U.S., in my eyes at least, is the favorite for gold. But we do have 2 games tomorrow, final recap. We'll break down the entire tournament, take a look at next year, so be sure to come back tomorrow. But with that, if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. If you'd like to drop a like, if you really consider subscribing, tell all your friends and comment down below your thoughts on semifinal action of the World Junior Championship. Until next time, see ya.